Donc on a une session
So the afternoon session
avec 3 intervenants.
it will include three
Oui, on a une session avec
speakers,
seulement 3 intervenants, ce qui
just three
va nous
speakers,
permettre
which is going to enable us
à la fois de
to
leur donner un petit peu plus de
give
temps
them maybe a bit more
et
time for their
aussi
presentations, but also
d'échanger
time for exchanges.
librement, et puisque le
And
comité,
given that
on est en comité un peu plus restreint, ça
there are fewer of us here,
je l'espère, je le souhaite, de parler.
this is going to enable us to perhaps speak more freely and to perhaps broaden the session and maybe deal with subjects that you would like to see dealt with. And this following the 3 half days we've spent together. This session, displacing, the process of displacing, is the result of the scientific committee's reflection on documents. We received a number of proposals which proposed that we shift our perception to other modes, which perhaps did not necessarily involve an architectural construction, but which would raise questions on ways of thinking, of perceiving, of feeling. That is to say, perhaps move the borders somewhat with regards to these intellectual tools with which we think about archaism. We have an order for the speakers. First of all, we want to give the floor to Esteban Restrepo, then to Roberto Passini, and then to Manuel Belomarcano. And during a coffee break, when talking about this displacing, we came to realize it was geographic to a certain extent, because all of you come from Central or Latin America. You're all Spanish speakers, and you're all going to make the effort of speaking either in French or English and not Spanish today. So this geographic displacement as well, which involves maybe a cultural one as well, and maybe more. How to initiate encounters and to bear in mind other ways of viewing the world. We're going to start with a kind of literary experience, because Esteban Restrepo is going to talk about, or rather is going to make his presentation starting from one of Kafka's short stories. I must say it was a short story that I was not familiar with and that I read so as to better understand the presentation you're going to be making this afternoon. So before giving you the floor, let me introduce you. Esteban Restrepo, you're an architect. You have a doctorate in compared literature from Paris 8 on the topic of the writer in architecture, the concept of architecture in literature, and you are at Paris-La Villette on the ATR. You have 15 minutes, maybe. I'll just wave at you 2 or 3 minutes before your time is up to let you know that you need to conclude. You had said that you wanted to allow the literary pictures to do their work, and so you have no pictures to project here. Good afternoon. My presentation is titled On the Traces of Architecture. So, architecture before architecture, Franz Kafka. A few months before his death, Franz Kafka wrote one of his last stories called Der Bau, which translated into French means the foxhole, what we would like to call the home, because of the work because of what follows. So this is the story of a creature which, isolated from the world, undertakes the construction of a home which will allow him to lead a peaceful life. And this because of his paranoia. This, in fact, is also going to allow him to counter the attacks by potential enemies whose existence is, in fact, simply an imperceptible hiss heard by the creature. Yet the Kafkaian creature is in an extreme technical precarity. It is not able to use material to be able to put this in the interstices. The species of the creature is never really revealed to us. It's located in a zone of indistinguishability and indecidability, somewhere between man and animal, as Gilles Deleuze says in Francis Bacon's Logic of Sensation. It is in a state of considerable technical precariousness, and this perhaps a lot like Kafka himself. So it's an indeterminate type of animal, which is why I refer to it as the creature. In this communication, we would like to explore the spatio-material strategies, which in fact will counteract the possible attack of his imaginary enemy. And the goal here is to ensure the protection, the survival of the inhabitant in the face of external creatures. Now, the first strategy consists in building underground. Because of the technical incapacity, the Kafkian character is going to build underground because he doesn't need to actually build, but simply excavate. Now, the wall is the archetype of vertical construction and the success of technique against gravity, or against gravity, as Schopenhauer says. The gallery is the archetype of underground construction. The negative architecture of excavation works in a manner similar to sculpture. It exists as a block, and the creature is a sculptor, removing pieces or blades matter, bringing out as much the figure as the bottom of the burrow. Here in the burrow, you have an excess of matter, but it remains in the middle of the earth itself. Having said this, galleries are not just excavation. The creature wants to stabilize the shape in order to avoid landslides inside their underground home. And this is quoting Kafka. Because here, I threw myself against the ground, happy as my head bled, because this was proof that the wall was becoming solid. End of quote. Now, the architecture of the underground home, in fact, subverts the features of the visibility specific to the art of building, which is fundamental to its perception. Indeed, all architecture is given to see thanks to the emptiness which surrounds it and which isolates it from its own mass, its mass. Now, usually our gaze is on the surfaces of a building. But for this action to take place, it calls for a space that will allow it. The underground condition of the burrow architecture of the Kafkan creature nullifies this possibility. At first glance, it is imperceptible. Indeed, from the outside, nothing is seen. And even if you could see something, it is either a big hole or a fake entry to trick any potential enemy. And this is without any cover of moss, which would in fact hide the real entry. Inside, the situation is not very different. The construction of galleries is going to create a constant proximity to the earth, preventing any long-term vision. Now, what about the second strategy? You need to conquer the entire place. Now, because of its paranoia, any plot is a threat to the creature that seems to want to replace the place where it is installing its home by its own construction. This is why he needs to constantly expand it. He needs to take ownership of all of the nooks and crannies, and including the other creatures, controlling them through an action that goes through architecture. Now, the form of the creature's home is indefinite and indeterminate, or it is continually overflowed. The burrow is the product of a concatenation and the conquest of different spaces, what we would call a hyper-architecture. The building we are talking about, the terrier, seems to be an utopia in power and, in a sense, is diverted from its usual meaning. It's neither an architecture that is conceived of or projected, and it is not realized in a real place. It is an imaginary place, but an architecture without a precise place insofar that it's trying to be all places at once, a universe in itself. This last meaning is the most consistent with the etymology of the term utopia. It is a non-place. It is only by becoming a universe, cutting off connection with other places, and becoming an absolute place, that the home of the creature becomes literally utopian. It is an architecture that wants to absorb the place and become both total and totalitarian. Now, this overflow occurs not only underground, but also on land. At the surface, the creature conquers the various elements of his natural surroundings, assigning them functions within the framework of the architectural system of his home, but without altering them formally or materially. Thus, a bush becomes a hiding place or spy station. Another instrument will be one of self-punishment, of a fault whose cause we do not know. These two bushes remain what they are. However, the fact that the creature uses these bushes for specific purposes is going to alter the mode of existence of these raw materials. The creature is architecturalizing them somewhat. However, discerning in the plurality of shapes and textures of his environment, to choose in the existing element and to divert it from its mode of existence, first to satisfy its desires, before actually undertaking the material manipulation, must already be considered as an architectural gesture. Now, the third strategy, the inner-outer dialectic, is practically non-existent in the construction of the Kafkaesque creature due to the absence of a powerful device of radical separation of the outside and the inside. Only a fragile foam cover claims to achieve this function. To replace this defect, the creature is going to develop between the entrance and its vault routes, trips, loopholes, a whole infrastructure of mobility in contrast to the development of a space to stay. In fact, the entire spatial distribution of the house is built by providing lures in order to mislead anyone who would dare to venture there. The creature conceives of a device which does not come under a certain hardness, that is to say, a frontal and resistant materiality that faces and thus stops the advancement of the invisible enemy, in the manner of a shield, but rather a trick, the labyrinth. Instead of confronting the enemy, the creature decides to misplace, to confuse, to exalt it, until it is no longer in a position to threaten it. But the earth is not the only material of the walls of the labyrinth. With meat, the essence of the creature's hunting spoils, the food of choice that it stores, the creature claims to develop an even more effective trap. It is going to use the meat as material to temporarily plug certain corridors and galleries. It becomes momentarily a wall or partition designed to block the passage of the enemy between the different spaces of the house. Thanks to this mobility of the meat partitioning, the space system can be permanently modified and functions as a labyrinth with a changing spatial layout. Thus, the victory over the enemy would be won not only because of the exhaustion of the latter following the search which is rendered useless, but also because of the permanent change in the spatial configuration of the burrow, claiming to drive the enemy mad. Fourth strategy: how to become Kafkian. Now, just as the strategies mentioned before do not seem enough to ensure the tranquility of the creature, surveillance will become one of its privileged and predominant activities. Thus, the creature, on his guard, will in fact consider that he must defend the space. And the creature, as the guard, will fulfill a task that the architecture cannot accomplish by itself. That is to say, to protect its inhabitant and its treasures during a possible eruption of the potential enemy. Indeed, most of the time, the creature is running from one end to the other of its space, from one chamber to the other, elaborating its construction. The guardian thus becomes an architecture, an organic architecture, which is painful because it has an impact on the nerves and the central nervous system, contrary to inorganic architecture, which, as a substitute for the skin, remains painless. And in this way, we become part of other structures, plant and mineral. The architectural skin, disconnected from our body, makes us insensitive to the outside. Indeed, this is before the recreation of other elements, the wall, the skin. We go from an endosomatic to an exosomatic situation. As Kafka says, the creature seems to have lost the limits of its own body and the limits of the architecture within which it lives. The earth and its own blood, which are connected by the nerves, connected to the architecture that it is building. Let me quote, "Unfortunately, it is because I am a possessor of this great work so fragile that I find myself defenseless against any serious attack. The happiness of possessing it has spoiled me. The fragileness of the bureau made me sensitive and fragile. Its wounds hurt me as if they were my own." End of quote. With that last strategy, the architecture seems to fail as a means of guaranteeing the protection and the survival of the creature. Yet the architecture in Kafka's narrative architecture, it is in fact a means of facing the unpredictable forces of the outside world. At this point, the creature seriously envisages abandoning its home to try something else out, invent a system more appropriate for its fears and anguish. And it is because of this, the potential enemy never arrives, and this is why Kafka's narrative is unfinished. All of this, in fact, work was on the basis of the assumption of a potential enemy attacking in its vital space, which never happens. This is a paranoid character, in fact, who considers to be real what is only imaginary. And this with consequences that have an impact at the architectural level. In fact, it is not this paranoid delirium as characterized by Kafka, which is going to lead to the development of an architecture with a capital A to organize a defense against an enemy that will never arrive. I would suggest that at this point we move on and we give the floor to Roberto Pasini. Roberto, let me introduce you. You're an architect. You obtained your PhD in architecture from the University of Harvard. Today, you are now an architecture professor at the University of Monterrey in Mexico. You are co-founder of the architecture firm Pasini and Romani. Now, the title of your presentation today. No, what I had remembered here was that there's a term of the symbiosis and symbiotic, which once again is going to lead us into another type of investigation regarding architecture and the environment. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank you all the new friends of Gerfaut who gave me this opportunity to be here, for your graceful hospitality and also for the opportunity to be in this beautiful city of Paris these days. This is Monterrey, Mexico, the place where I come from. It has got also relationship with what I'm going to present today, because you see the three elements that are the steep mountains, the horizontal extent of the city, and also the vertical stacking of the towers that are being implemented. This is my school, the School of Architecture of Monterrey. And with this, I think I have paid my duties to the agencies that are funding my long trip back home via many stops. I'm going to show you a few images before the actual presentation. This is the subtitle of a book, A Journey Through the Regions of Landscape, that is coming out in the next 2 weeks with Springer. And the actual title is Landscape Paradigms and Post-Urban Spaces. I actually wanted to reverse the thing, title and subtitle, but the editors preferred it like this. The book talks about various things. In the introduction, it somehow defines what will be called the symbiotic field, referring to this landscape continuum in which we are living after the demise of the Urbus, the curved trench that used to separate the urban space from the wilderness and the rural land outside. The first part describes and analyzes our geographic condition in which we are living today, the attributes of this new kind of urbanity or cityness outside of the actual city that follows the, let's say, metropolitanist wave that started in 1978 with the publication of Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas and all its affiliations, the most recent, like, for example, landscape urbanism and so on. The second part of the book defines what is referred to as the symbiotic landscape paradigm, in which I'm trying to somehow keep together two perspectives that are usually conflicting over the landscape, which is the culturalist and the cognitivist or scientific perspective, two very different ways of regarding the landscape and this landscape continuum in which we are living. So the experiment is to build a paradigm that keeps together polarities that are conflicting, but within an acceptable dialectic. Finally, in chapter 8, I describe a little, very modest project that we have implemented with a group of people from the Universidad de Monterrey. It's called Tests for a Symbiotic Material, which is fundamentally an in situ transcription of the symbiotic landscape paradigm. And then the conclusions, agenda for the next landscape, I will skip and leave for the next occasion. This is the site. Well, first of all, up on the left, upper left corner, you see the conglomeration of Monterrey. It's a 5 million conglomeration, which is clashing against the Sierra Madre Oriental of Mexico. And you see these ridges that are very dramatic. On the bottom, you see the actual site, which is located where the little red circle is indicated. This is an aerial view of the site. It is actually a path, a trail, and I have, of course, submitted my paper, but I will limit myself to read one page only. The Test for a Symbiotic Material is a landscape installation implemented in the mountains of northeastern Mexico. It is located in a natural site of the Parque Ecológico Chipinque, touched by the expanding infrastructures of the 5 million metropolitan area of Monterrey. The installation can be characterized as an in situ transcription of the symbiotic landscape paradigm. The installation is the experimental phase of a longer research project on the contemporary built natural continuum. The project converts an abandoned trail for the maintenance of a high voltage line, violently crossing the area, into a 5-meter-long journey through the luxuriant ecosystem. The travel through the Matorral is orchestrated on 3 levels. On the surface, the trek pursues the edifying didactical aim of promoting awareness about the richness, beauty, and fragility of the natural environment that surrounds us, by offering the school children of Monterrey an ecological route equipped with informative signposting illustrating flora, fauna, and their metabolism. On a deeper level, the path aims at destabilizing the conventional anthropocentric perspective. A sequential apparatus of partial installations gradually submerges the visitor into a multifocal exploration where the human perceptive sphere fuses with those of the many other inhabitants of the Matorral. The installations let you hear like a rabbit, smell like a bear, see like a coyote, and fly like a green jay. Third and deepest layer of the journey, the installation is the spatial transcription of a narrative, that is a story or myth, intended to implant a novel sense in the contemporary landscape of our existences. The installation is, in fact, an in situ plotting of 2 overlapped paradigms that envision the landscape from the apparently opposed geophilosophical and scientific perspectives, respectively Deleuze-Guattari's paradigm of the becoming, and in particular the becoming animal, and Dalmau Farina's paradigm of the cognitive landscape. By that, the installation tests in practice the possible reconciliation of aesthetic territorialist and scientific metabolist models, previously conjectured in the theoretical phases of the research and referred to as symbiotic field. The portal, the path of the animal trails, the glade of becoming, the floral abyss, the circle of contemplation are the main components of the route. The glade of becoming, on the glade of becoming, a narrative is plotted in a play of shadows between rocks, water, and cactuses, which culminates in the central installation of the establishment of the totem at the crossing of the axis of the becoming daemon and the axis of the functional trait. Archaic figures, they surface from the profundity of the earth to give shape to the present, by means of implanting a novel mythology of ancient forms into our contemporary continuum. I will now show you a few images of the project, starting with this one, which somehow brings together all the elements that characterize the place. This beautiful foliage of the Matorral, which is an ecosystem of thicket and similar to the Mediterranean maquis, but of course displaced in the Sierra Madre Oriental of Mexico. And then this beautiful formation of nopal with the ripe prickly pears laden with a lot of fruit, and the presence of the infrastructural element, this violent pylon of the high voltage line. On the first level, on the surface, this is nothing but a florofaunistic route. So we have designed a route that starts with a trail crossed by fauna paths, and each path is identified with signposting, and some scientific information about the species of the animal is given. Then there is a central part, which is the glade of becoming, and there is a concentration of a number of installations that are sort of involve the visitor into an interaction. And then the third part is this floral abyss, in which the signposting is mainly focused on vegetation, and it terminates into this little circle, which we call the circle of contemplation, which hits into the cliff where the path bifurcates, and it's sort of end of the trip. This is the original condition of the trail, so there is a very dense vegetation. We first of all designed a portal in order to start the trail, and this gate separates the world of humans to the word from the words of many animals. This is the gate. and this is the information that is engraved into this plate of metal, which gives some orientation to the visitor. We mapped all the fauna trails, and we transformed this first mapping into formal signposting. You see here some information about the metabolism of the ecosystem and then of the animals. There is also a fauna that is composed of insects, we separate between the ones which fly and the ones which don't fly, crawl or something. And then there is a signposting that identifies all the plants. It's very, very conventional and very simple. There are beautiful formations. Of course, it is a sort of nature garden, but it's a spontaneous nature garden which we found already there, and we simply recognized and started to identify in its components. This is a nopal formation. You can see when you start the visit these beautiful flowers, which in an hour and a half after the end of the walk would open and create a completely different composition, floral composition. And this is the day of the inauguration. Her name is Maria. She is a school child from Monterrey, and this is the first step of school children through the gate, and then after her all the others. The group was led away from the human infrastructure into the matorral. It was separated in small groups in order to give them information about the flora and the fauna. Some information given by Fernanda Rosas. And by Andrea Ramos. Also, the senses, not only, let's say, scientific information, but also touching and smelling. On a deeper level, it is also, we have said, a sort of destabilization of the anthropocentric perspective over the landscape. Well, this is the Glade of Becoming. Here we have tried to plot the becoming animal paradigm of Deleuze Guattari, in particular Guattari. We see a series of three axes, which are the becoming hare, the becoming bear, and the becoming coyote, which are a sequence of animalities in which the visitor is brought into the perceptive sphere of each one of the species in a sequence of three plus the fourth one, which is the bird, the green jay, up in the observatory. This creates a longitudinal axis that is a multiple animality, which we call the path of the becoming demon, which means that you abandon your human condition to become something different. Here a bit of information about the species that are somehow proposed to the visitors. And here is the young visitor approaching the glade, and the group of the Mestizo crew who helped involve the children in a few, let's say, performances and games and playful activities. They go through the arch and they start seeing the hare and envisioning regarding the landscape through the perspective of the hare. And then the second animal is the bear. The bear is rising from one side of the glade and is walking towards the other side, and then it crawls and invites the kids to crawl with him. Then they sort of start experiencing the attitudes of the animal, and they are actually enjoying it. And then the third animal is the coyote. Well, there is also, apart from the attitudes and the experience of the attitude of the animal, there are also scientific information about the species. To end with the Green Jay up in the, let's say, observatory. And the kids are invited to climb up this little tower of observation and gain a different perspective over the matorral, which is this very soft cover of the hillsides and lower mountain sides of the Sierra Madre Oriental. It is also about implanting a methodology. There is a series of installations that we could call more artistic. For example, the branches of the matorral from one side to another are intertwined together, and in this, which becomes a sort of vegetal gallery with the intervention of a local artist who helped us to install the actual installation like this one, Rodrigo Legorreta. LGO Rodrigo Legorreta. Once you enter the portal, you find the other installation of the site that we see here, the three axes of the becoming animals, the trajectory of the becoming demon, the tower of the, let's say, bird watching or observatory. In truth, you are not watching the birds, you are watching from the point of view of the birds. And then this central axis that I will show you through this diagram. Here intervenes the second paradigm, which is the one with the zoom from Almofarina. This is what we call the functional trait axis, which goes from one nopal, this one nopal formation on this side to another nopal formation on the other side, underlined by the presence of two stone sculptures that we placed, and then crossing the becoming demon axis in the central point where a central installation is installed. If this is the becoming demon and the becoming animal paradigm, this is so the geophilosophical paradigm that is plotted into the site. Well, this is the cognitive paradigm that is plotted into the side, and they cross into this very point with a lifted stone in a zoomorphic configuration, and then another stone lying on the ground with a little concavity that collects water. And there is a play of shadows between the elevated stone and the stone on the ground, and refraction and transparencies on the water that is collected inside. Well, you see here details from the two formations of nopal. You can imagine that now they are laden with bright prickly pears, like you see here in this drawing by Andrea Ramos, and the other formation that is vertical, this is horizontal on the other side. So this is the point that we call the institution of the totem, which in sort of Levi-Straussian terms means a very clear transition in the cultural evolution of a group. So here you can see the play of shadows. Well, there are several paradigms that are somehow overlapped on top of this glade of becoming. I will go through them very, very fast, but this is derived from this idea of having a transversal cut of signs and a longitudinal cut of things of Benjamin. And then the multiplication of the transversal cut bearing facialities. So this is an interpretation of Benjamin through Deleuze-Guattari, and the positioning of two different observers. This is the observer that goes through and is somehow immersed in the time in the chronological time, in the time of Chronos. The other one is the standing observer. He is immobile, and he is immersed in the time of Aeon. It's two ways of regarding the landscape. And this is the final, let's say, superimposition of various paradigms that we have seen, in which we see a multiplication of the observers, which are not only human, but they are also animal or insects, and then tilting of the, let's say, transversal plane of signs, and the multiplication of the longitudinal organization of the vertical facialities. Well, it doesn't really make a real difference in concrete terms, but this is the sort of mythology that we are trying to embed into this installation. This is the final result of the Glade of Becoming. There is a little vegetation, a little flora that is implanted on top of the installation, so it is a hanging garden in a way, and there are holes that are pierced through the stones in order for them to be colonized by vegetation or fauna. And somehow the fauna is living there because we implanted it artificially, honestly, otherwise we should have had to wait for ages. But there is also a form of colonization from insects that, as you can see, are multiplying and proliferating. Also, the space is used by animals. We can see through a fauna camera that we placed that there is a wild turkey, a family of wild boars, which are becoming sort of pets. And then, 5 minutes? Yes. And then we have here the gray fox and a coyote. But also we had a visit from a puma, which is more, exotic. So it is a space that is shared by animals, insects, plants, and also people. As you can see here, we have the visits. We also have these artistic performances in it. It is also an atmospheric space. It is atmospheric because it's very changeable, it's weathery. It changes a lot with the changing weather conditions. It can assume very different aspects. This is a view of the site, and in the background you can see the contiguity of the city, of the metropolitan area that is expanding, hitting into the Sierra Madre. Also, you see the presence of the infrastructures. Well, after the abyss, floral abyss that you somehow start walking from the exit of the Glade of Becoming, going through beautiful plants and vegetation, like for example this beautiful large agave and large nopal formations, you reach the final point of the visit, which is the circle of contemplation. You see how it hits into this cliff covered with vegetation. Well, as explained in the signposting, this is a special point because it is an ecotone. So from the Matorral submontano, here starts a transition into a different ecosystem, which is the Bosque Montano, in which higher vegetation is to be found. And you can notice how this, let's say, this becomes clear when you expand the frame of the image. So in a way, there are these archaic figures that have already been there since ever, but like we are somehow identifying and make more visible and clearly perceivable, and we try to explain them both in let's say, geophilosophical terms and also in scientific terms. At the end of the, we have a 2-year program of site visit with different groups of students from the primaries of Monterrey. And we ran a series of, well, a little interview at the beginning before the trek, and then another interview at the end of the trek. And we compare the result of the 2 interviews through this graphic. You can see it here. Well, we ask very simple questions. For example, do you think this place is beautiful? How many animals do you think live here? How many plants do you think you can find here? And also we ask, can you name a series of animals that you think live here? And also we ask, do you think this place is valuable for us living in the city nearby? And what you see here is what we can call the plotting of the ecological awareness before the excursion, and in red, the plotting of the ecological awareness of the kids after the trek. And you see that there is a discrepancy, so we can think that it had some kind of result. And certainly we make their day. They're very glad to be out of school, and they enjoy the trek. Here it ends. But I want to introduce to you the team of the people who worked on this little project. And it's Patricio Garza, Fernanda Rosas, Andrea Verde Ramos, and Elgio Rodrigo Legorreta, and others. So this is just a sequence of images of the making of, selecting the stones from a canyon, the Huasteca Canyon, and then drilling them, piercing them, sculpting them, and then installing the parts, and then starting to study or invent the choreography, and then rehearsing the choreographies, and then various attempts to read the place as a locus where history, the verticality of history, hits the horizontality of geography and creates the locus as memory, as a sort of frozen memory. So touching the senses. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So many things to put in dialogue between the two approaches to relations to space and environment that can be approached. Let's keep all the questions for after the third presentation by Manuel Bello Marcano. Manuel, I'll give you the floor. You're an architect, you're a PhD in social sciences, and you're master assistant at the National School of Architecture of Saint-Étienne, in charge of a study group Transformation, Interdisciplinary Center on the Expression, Contemporaneous Expression. There, I'm leaving you the floor without much ado to go on with the non-human, since I think your presentation is... Let's get back to our sheep. Thank you for this, and thank you for the communication that I have just listened to.
I think that the presentations we've had is very much linked to my work, which is pretty theoretical. I'll try to be as clear as possible, even if there are a lot of things at stake. I've called it Coming Back to Our Sheep, the arc, the architecture, and the animal. A train in Japan that barks to avoid crushing deer in the middle of the tracks. Ducks, in fact, in rice fields in the Camargue, sheep in from Ouessant who maintain ring roads in Paris, in eco-grazing, donkeys and horses that clear the future course of Serqueux-Gisors train line. News regurgitates anthropological reports at once innovative and strangely on. And if to see further in the future, we need to review the past. Architecture, and here I would like to make a clear difference. Architecture is compared to a type of organization. I'd like to come back to this definition, which was echoed in the preceding one. So architecture seems to be able to testify to the union of these two extremes, which are archaic and technological, to rehabilitate, urbanize, protect. These actions that we have always taken as the goodwill of the architectural discipline are now orphaned by context and emptied of their meaning after the antics of a cyclopean modernity whose only eye restricted us to progress. In the meanwhile, the human world is becoming more and more strange for the diversity of life. The vital melody of the world is now threatened by anthropological distortions that dull it. Now, is this visible or not? Is this visible to everyone? The speaker is being asked by the audience to speak slowly. They can't follow him. So, in fact, we see that the vital melody of the world is now threatened by anthropological distortions that dull it, leaving us in a sterile silence that normalizes and impoverishes the riches of life. Now, in this paper, we want to question the role of architecture as a place of communion with the animal through the valorization and openness to what is foreign to us, as a form of sharing life and death, and finally, as an architectural relation to confinement and protection. Thus, we will open this questioning on three movements. The first of these I have called the fabulous strangeness of the worlds. First of all, we need to ask ourselves whether the meeting of the other is really at the root of the problems of architecture. To leave oneself to meet the other can be a privileged path to open the architectural thought to other horizons. Now, traditionally, one of the goals of architecture is to strip the world of its strangeness, to transform it, to make us feel more at home. We architects master nature to make it always more human and familiar. But the world we live in no longer needs to protect itself from the inclement weather of nature. The human being is not a species in extinction. Now, in this respect, architecture no longer carries the standard of resistance to nature, and paradoxically, it is also difficult to wear that of the protection of nature. What can architecture be today? To answer this question, we must avoid the sequestration of architectural thought by opportunistic ecologies, which are based on environmental disasters and technocratic production systems. Now, to trace the fresco of a metamorphosis of architecture, we will have to look at the world differently. And if the first task of architecture is rather to think otherness by stripping the objective world of its familiarity, so that we feel a little less at home, as Vinciane Després remarks. What does this "we" mean today when we no longer only discover that we live with animals, with humans from different cultures, but with those non-humans that are animals? How to think architecture in the face of such alterities? Today, broadening what is familiar and sharing what is alien is a dual responsibility of architecture, because it is as much about thinking of the other as of realizing and assuming that one is thinking of the other. In this respect, one of the goals of architecture as a discipline could be to think of the human and non-human alien, how to awaken the architecture of his humanistic sleep. Thinking of the animal is more than a problem of constructing a frame. It's a problem of cosmology. We will have to work with pluralities of animals to allow us to think differently about architecture, its margins and boundaries, the definition of we, you, them, with whom to collaborate. Considering the architecture of this world stripped of its familiarity requires us to readjust and shift the architectural discipline of its classic setting. This leads us to a second movement, a cannibalistic love. Humans and animals have shared for millennia not only the earth as their home, but also stories of struggles and resistance to the adverse forces of nature. Since the Neolithic period, which was about 10,000 years ago, human beings have raised animals for slaughter. During all this time, these animals have participated in the world of humans. Together, they have shared life and death as livelihoods, as well as work, food, and the way to interact with nature, which they often protect collectively from bad weather. To domesticate and protect and then slaughter and consume is one of the archaic programs of architecture of this human-animal community. Domestication is thus a form of organization of the world. In France, this form of organization has a long tradition. But since the Second World War, we have progressively emptied our rural territories for the benefit of mechanization of animal husbandry and slaughter. We have violently transformed not only our way of life, but life itself, its representations, its practices, and imaginaries. We were stuck between the exotic, wild animals that we had to protect as an ecological obligation and almost aesthetic need for strangers. Today, faced with mechanization and industrialization of death, the return to old gestures of animal husbandry and slaughter seem to prefigure the organization of another world. Old farming methods have become not only an ethical problem, but selling points. Today, these gestures, now economically luxurious, have once built places of sharing, landscapes, and environments not considered heritage. They conveyed spatial significance while being an elementary structure of interspecific human-animal communication. Reflecting on the margins and boundaries of the world from these gestures and what they communicate is in this respect an architectural problem. But it is these margins and these links that define our living spaces, our subjectivity, and our relationship to the world. The mission is to protect life in its diversity and thickness, to preserve possibility of exploring a world that is not always familiar but still unknown, disturbing, and foreign. Currently, the denunciation of militant organizations like L214 in France, the implementation of the video surveillance of animals executed in slaughterhouses, finally, the whole question of animal welfare is one of the stakes of our civilization in the same way as the transformation of capitalism, post-colonialism, or social and biological equalities. Cruelty, suffering, cannibalism, and sacrifice, or on the contrary, dignity, respect, freedom, are concepts that resonate daily and whose echoes and implications in the human world seem to come from far away. But what seems to be the real architectural challenge in animal welfare is the objectification of the animal as a problem of domestication of the world. Indeed, animal welfare refers to conditions of environmental comfort which are still based on domestication. Thus, for example, the release of battery hens in the open air, liberation of spatial conditions of its breeding, makes domestication an archaic fact whose outdoor is not necessarily a physiological question, but rather a cultural one. Probably a hen would not survive long in the outdoors next to a forest. Do we face an inevitable slaughter of the world? Domestication, rearing, and slaughter oblige us to think of the animal as a problem of anthropomorphism. That is to say, as a form that shapes us, as a plasticity and an expression, but also as a sign and power of appearance. Although the form of the animal is in dialogue with the form of the human, it is because the human integrates the animal into it. Granted, as the bee and the flower, the animal and the human reflect a kind of original consonance in which one seems to be made for the other. Indeed, the animal builds ontologically man as a degree of being, but always on a biological and physiological basis. Thus, the animal proteins that we consume, a nitrogen source essential to our life, are an integral part of a biochemical cycle that binds us to the living as an environment. This functional circle between the organism and the surrounding world is what the biologist J.V. Yuxell calls an Umwelt, a word that we translated in France by middle. It is the medium as a musical dialogue that we call, according to Yuxell, a vital melody of the world. Now, the third movement, ark and slaughterhouse, or eccentric architecture. As Yuxell points out, to think living means to think of an inseparable body of a world that constructs it. Breeding and slaughtering can be situations of a specific nature, where the reading of the signs of the living depends intimately on the domesticist exchange. This can reveal the primary spatial conditions of the relationship we have with animals. In other words, being sensitive to this conversation is a tool for deciphering the original conditions of the world. So if we've replaced in the industrial slaughter the gesture of the human body by the movement of the machine, can we integrate in this same gesture the reading of the signs proper to the middle of the beast? Researchers like Temple Grayson have advanced in this field. Now, when we speak of animals, we are often at the center of the old debate between an archaic, even animistic vitalism and a technological and positive mechanism. We continue to consider that, in this context, the animal is both a machine and a living being. But this duality in which the life of the animal has been imprisoned is only the expression of a fundamental unity. What is the point of injunction where the imprisonment and capture of the living has been at the anthropological but also ontological level one of the privileged objects of architecture? Now, Plessner defined man as an immigrant of nature, incapable of root because tirelessly contingent. The existence of the man is always thought by this one like a center. For Plessner, being is therefore continually an eccentric form. This eccentricity is not only ontological, but also spatial and architectural. And in this respect, it's not insignificant if, according to the hypothesis of Hubert Damisch, we can consider structures such as Noah's Ark as the first act of architecture. Unable to find a place until after the flood, the ark is not only a symbol of survival, but it is also the incarnation of man as an immigrant of nature. For Damisch, protecting and arranging animals in a small space would then be one of the main topics of architecture. However, the eccentric logic of the arc operates more as a mode of ordering spaces of preservation of the bodies, human and non-human, than as a form of organization of the living. Is it a digression of architecture facing centuries of anthropozoological relationship? How can we therefore return to our sheep in order to repair the human-animal pact and be able to rewrite architecture? Fourth argument, openness, architecture in the night of animality. One solution would be to reconsider the animal as an original phenomenon of man. Although human, anthropological animality has often been a source of shame in Judeo-Christian history, animal theological humanity is not only a source of pity but also a myth. Speaking of Breuil's remarks on the drawing, in the cave of the three brothers, Georges Bataille observes there exists in the archaic representation an astonishing eraser of man in front of the animal at the moment when the animal in him became human. He takes as a reference a figure known as the sorcerer or the god who only half possesses the human form with the head of an animal. Indeed, he asserts that not only did the ancient man give the animal an image that was both fascinating and naturalistic, but that when he nonetheless wished and awkwardly to represent what he himself was, he concealed the features of the one he really was under those of the beast that he was not. Bataille reveals the interest that presents to us the passage from the animal to the man, indicating that for the primitive man, the decisive step took place when this one, which was seen as far from being ashamed like us, the animal part that remained in him disguised the humanity that distinguished him from animals. He hid the face we are proud of and spread out what hides our clothes. Now, when did animality become something hidden or invisible? And if the will of man in architecture was only that of controlling the animal, but controlling its visibility as well, the strangeness of this chimera, locked up in a humanity disguised as a beast, forcibly returns us to the myth of the Minotaur, to be monstrous, also locked in architecture, in the image of its occupant. The story of Bataille's sorcerer, who is not ashamed to hide his humanity behind animality, or the Minotaur, which links his animality to that of the labyrinth, illustrate two forms of confinement as well as the same opening to anthropozoological relationships that we can maintain with architecture. Now, in these examples, human animality seems to disappear to reappear. It becomes invisible in order to be able to become itself again. This condition of human animality can be described as a relation of commensality, where the end of the animal is the beginning of the man, and vice versa. An architecture of commensality would therefore be an organizing thought, perhaps colonizing, without the possibility of causing harm to the one, the human, or the other, the animal. However, such a project is still vast because this architectural challenge must be able to build culturally a multiplicity of operating and complementary looks, rethinking the biocosmological dimension of the place of the human in the world from the animal. And this is not just an economic story, but in a way it's a veritable love affair.